Hey guys, tonight we drift back through the mists of time, not to a battlefield or a king's court, but to the quiet, cold edge of a fjord. Imagine the deep, resonant sound of a gjallarhorn, not calling men to war, but sending a soul to its final long rest. We're standing on the shore of a world that chose a different path, a world where the great Viking age never truly ended, because its spirit was never tamed, never converted. The sheer scale of what was altered by the historical conversion is staggering. It's not just about which god you prayed to, but about the very DNA of Western civilization. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The ship is a masterpiece of dark oak, its proud dragon head staring defiantly towards the open sea. It's not a warship, not today. Today it is a pyre, a vessel for the dead. On its deck, surrounded by his finest weapons, his favourite drinking horn, and the loyal hounds that will follow him on his last journey, lies a great Jarl. His family and his people line the shore, their faces lit by the flickering torchlight. There are no priests here whispering prayers of salvation, no scent of incense, no talk of a meek and loving God. There are only runes carved into the ship's hull, invoking the favour of Odin, the All-Father, for the voyage to Valhalla and the quiet, stoic grief of a people sending one of their own to the feasting halls of the gods. An archer steps forward, his bowstring drawn taut. For a moment he holds, the flaming arrow a single point of defiant light against the deep twilight blue of the Nordic sky. Then he releases. This scene, or one much like it, is the heart of our question tonight. What if this never went away? What if the slow, creeping tide of Christianity, which washed over Scandinavia between the 8th and 12th centuries, had simply broken against the rocks of the old faith? In our history, the conversion was a complex, often brutal affair. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason of Norway are said to have converted chieftains by dangling their children over cauldrons of boiling water, which, as a sales pitch for a religion of peace, is certainly a bold choice. But it was often a political and economic calculation as much as a spiritual one. To be a pagan king in a Christianizing Europe was to be a pariah, an outcast from the lucrative trade networks and the political alliances that were shaping the modern world. Your neighbours weren't just your neighbours anymore. They were the faithful, and you were the heathen. That's a tough position to be in when you're trying to run a kingdom. Yet, what if the North had found a way to resist that pressure? What if they had looked at the power, the wealth, and the politics of Christian Europe, and decided the price was too high? The price wasn't just giving up a few gods, it was a wholesale cultural surrender. It was abandoning a worldview that celebrated the warrior's life, the binding power of the oath, and the inescapable nature of fate, or word. It was accepting concepts like original sin, a deeply foreign idea to a people who believed that a man was judged by his actions and his honour, not by an inherited stain on his soul. Historians continue to debate whether the conversion was a matter of genuine spiritual change or a calculated political necessity for the Scandinavian elite. In our timeline, it was likely a messy combination of both. But in the world we're exploring tonight, the scales tip the other way. Imagine the Jarls and kings coming together, not in a formal council, but in the way these things were done, over horns of mead in a smoky longhouse. They've heard the tales from the missionaries, they've seen the power of the southern emperors, and they make a choice. They choose defiance. They choose Odin and Thor, Freya and Frigg. A fascinating little detail from our own history is a practice called prim signing, or prime signing. Vikings who wanted to trade with Christian lands would often undergo a preliminary rite, making the sign of the cross and accepting a sort of probationary status that allowed them access to Christian markets without full baptism. It was a brilliant, pragmatic solution. In our alternate history, this is the compromise that sticks. The North agrees to play nice, to be Christian adjacent for business purposes, but when they return to their own lands, to their own families, they return to the gods of their ancestors. They take the Christian silver, but they refuse their saviour. So as we watch that flaming arrow arc through the sky and strike the tar-soaked wood of the funeral ship, we are not watching a relic of the past. We are watching a living, breathing faith. The flames that leap up from the deck don't just consume a body, They illuminate a different future, a Europe with a permanent, powerful pagan north, a world where the longship, not the Crusaders' cross, remains the symbol of Scandinavian identity, a world where the warrior's path to Valhalla is still open. The ship drifts out into the centre of the fjord, a floating pyre against the colossal stillness of the mountains. The horn sounds one last time, its mournful, proud call echoing across the water, a promise and a farewell. It's a powerful image, isn't it? But this faith, this defiant paganism, what was it really? What was the shape of the world seen through the eyes of a Norseman? Before we can understand the world they would have built, we have to understand the world they believed in. To understand that world, you have to look up, past the smoke of the pyre, and see the branches of a colossal ash tree cradling the stars. This is Yggdrasil, the world tree, the central pillar of all existence. Its roots drink from the wells of fate and wisdom, while its highest branches shelter Asgard, the home of the gods. Your world, the world of mortals, is Midgard, the Middle Yard, a realm surrounded by an impassable ocean and encircled by the great serpent Jormungandr, who is forever biting his own tail. This is not a faith of distant, abstract heavens and hells. It is a cosmology that feels immediate, physical, and profoundly interconnected. The rustling of leaves in the wind could be the whispers of the squirrel Ratatoska, carrying insults between the eagle at the top of the tree and the dragon gnawing at its roots. The ground beneath your feet is not just dirt, it is the flesh of the primordial giant Ymir, from whose body Odin and his brothers fashioned the world. The oceans are his blood, the mountains his bones. It is a world born of violence, and one that lives in a constant dynamic tension. At the heart of this world are the gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, and they are anything but simple. Take Odin, the All-Father. He's not a benevolent, all-loving father figure. He's a relentless seeker of knowledge and power, and he's willing to pay any price for it. He plucked out his own eye and dropped it into the well of Mimir in exchange for a drink of cosmic wisdom. He stabbed himself with his own spear and hung for 9 nights on Yggdrasil itself, a sacrifice of himself to himself, to learn the secrets of the runes. He is the god of poetry, magic and inspiration, but also of the battle fury, the gallows, and the glorious death that leads to Valhalla. To worship Odin is to embrace the unsettling truth that wisdom and pain are often two sides of the same coin. Then there is his son, Thor, the champion of Midgard. While Odin is cunning and cloaked in shadow, Thor is straightforward, powerful, and a bit hot-headed. With his hammer, Mjolnir, he is the tireless defender of humanity against the giants of Jotunheim, the forces of chaos that constantly threaten to overwhelm the ordered world. He is the god of the common man, the farmer, the warrior. When thunder rolls across the sky, it is the sound of his chariot wheels. He's relatable, dependable, and occasionally tricked into dressing as a bride to get his hammer back. A quirky detail from the Poetic Edda that shows these gods were not above a bit of cosmic comedy. He was the protector, the divine bouncer keeping the forces of chaos out of humanity's longhouse. And the goddesses were no less complex. Freya, of the Vanir tribe of gods, is a perfect example. She is the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. Yes, but to leave it there is to profoundly misunderstand her. She's also a goddess of war, a practitioner of the powerful and somewhat feared magic known as Seda, and she is the leader of the Valkyries. When a battle is over, she and Odin divide the heroic dead between them. Half go to Odin's Valhalla, and the other half go to her own hall, Folkvanga. This isn't a passive, gentle goddess of romance. She is a formidable power who presides over life, death, and everything in between. And then there is Loki, the agent of chaos. Not purely evil in the Christian sense of a devil, but a trickster, a shapeshifter, a being of immense cunning and malice who is bound by blood oath to Odin, yet constantly works to undermine the gods. He is the unpredictable variable, the flaw in the system that ensures nothing is ever truly static, and that everything is moving towards its inevitable dramatic conclusion, Ragnarok. This faith was not something you attended once a week. It was woven into the very fabric of society and law. There was no holy book, no divine set of commandments handed down from on high. Instead, law was a communal affair, decided by free men at the local assembly, known as the Thing or Thing. This is an absolutely crucial historical fact to grasp. Norse society was, in its own way, profoundly democratic. At the Thing, disputes were settled, laws were made, and justice was dispensed, not by a priest or a king, but by the community itself, based on precedent and public consensus. Your most valuable possession was your haida, your personal honour and reputation. It dictated your standing, your worth, and your ability to function in society. An oath, sworn publicly, was the highest bond, and to be an oathbreaker was to be cast out. The Norse worldview was also shaped by the powerful concept of word, or fate. The Norns, 3 mysterious female figures sat at the base of Yggdrasil, weaving the destiny of every god and mortal. But this wasn't a simple predestination that absolved you of responsibility. Your fate was woven, yes, but how you met that fate was entirely up to you. It was this belief that fueled the famous Viking courage. If the Norns had already decreed the day of your death, why cower in fear? Better to meet it head-on, with an axe in your hand and a defiant roar on your lips, and earn a place in the sagas. Scholars often argue whether the average Norseman saw the gods as literal, physical beings who walked the earth, or as powerful allegorical forces representing the chaos and order of their world. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, a faith that was both deeply personal and grandly cosmic. One particularly intimate aspect of this was the belief in the fylgja, a sort of attendant spirit, often in the form of an animal, that was tied to an individual or a family line. It could offer guidance in dreams or appear at the moment of death, a supernatural companion on the journey through life. This, then, was the spiritual and legal world of the pre-Christian North. It was a system that explained the harsh realities of their existence, celebrated the virtues of courage and honour, and gave every individual a role to play in the great ongoing drama of the cosmos. It was a faith perfectly forged for its environment and its people. So why, in our history, did they give it all up? What could possibly convince a culture so deeply intertwined with its gods to turn its back on them and embrace the White Christ from the south? The conversion of Scandinavia wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding process that lasted for centuries. It was a messy, complex affair driven by a potent cocktail of faith, greed, politics, and power. Imagine yourself a Viking raider in the late 8th or 9th century, sacking a monastery on the coast of Northumbria. You and your men overwhelm the monks, who offer little resistance. You find no great warriors to fight, only strange men in robes who chant and pray as you break down their doors. Inside, you find treasures beyond your wildest dreams, chests of silver, golden crucifixes, illuminated manuscripts with jewel-encrusted covers. To you, this is simply wealth. But it's also your first, violent introduction to the Christian God, and you can't help but notice that this God, for all the talk of his power, seems utterly incapable of protecting his own houses or his own followers. From your perspective, Thor would have answered a challenge like this with a bolt of lightning. This new God just takes it. This was the first phase of contact, violent, transactional, and deeply confusing. But as Vikings began to settle in places like England, Ireland, and Normandy, the nature of the interaction changed. It moved from raiding to trading, from conquest to coexistence. And this is where the whispers of the cross truly began. A Viking trader living in the Danelaw, the part of England under Norse rule, would find himself surrounded by Christians. His business partners, his neighbours, and perhaps even a woman he wished to marry were all part of this other faith. To get along, to build trust, to be part of the community, there was immense pressure to at least accommodate their beliefs. We see this in the fascinating archaeological finds from the period, like the famous Thor's hammer amulets found alongside Christian crosses, sometimes even in the same grave. There was a period of spiritual hedging your bets, a time when a Norseman might just call on Jesus as well as Thor, just to cover all his bases. After all, if this Christ God was so powerful in these new lands, perhaps it was wise to add him to your personal pantheon. The real turning point, however, came from the top down. The crucial historical fact is that the eventual conversion of the Scandinavian kingdoms was primarily a royal initiative. Scandinavian kings and would-be kings in the 10th and 11th centuries were ambitious men. They weren't just jarls anymore. They were trying to build unified nations on the European model, and that model was Christian. To be a pagan king meant you were, by definition, an outsider. The The powerful rulers of the Holy Roman Empire or the kings of France would not see you as an equal. They would not forge alliances with you. They would not marry their daughters to your sons, and they would be far more likely to support a Christian rival to your throne. A shared religion was the diplomatic language of medieval Europe, and if you couldn't speak it, you were left out in the cold. A quirky, humanizing detail of this process can be seen in the story of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth. The gelling stones, massive runestones he erected in Denmark, are often called Denmark's birth certificate. One side has a classic Norse-style animal carving, but the other has the earliest known depiction of Christ in Scandinavia. Harald boasts on the stone that he made the Danes Christian. It was a political statement, a massive billboard announcing to the rest of Europe, "We're part of the club now." He saw Christianity as a tool for unifying his kingdom and cementing his own power. Missionaries played their part, of course, often with immense bravery. Figures like Ansgar, the Apostle of the North, made perilous journeys into what Christians considered the heart of darkness. These missions were often spectacular failures. Ansgar's first church in Sweden was burned down, and he was driven out. But they were persistent. The missionaries learned to be clever. They didn't just preach, they performed miracles. A famous story involves a missionary named Poppo, who allegedly held a red-hot piece of iron in his bare hand without being burned to prove the power of his god over the Norse gods. Whether this actually happened is beside the point. The story itself became a powerful piece of propaganda. The debate among historians rages on. Was it the genuine appeal of Christian theology, or the demonstration of God's power through such miracles and the promise of a powerful political ally that won the people over? It was a clash of magics in a way. The Norse had their cedar and runes, but the Christians had their relics, their holy water, and their seemingly fireproof priests. The process was also incredibly violent. Olaf Tryggvason in Norway and Olaf II, later St. Olaf, were ruthless in their methods. They burned down pagan temples, tortured and executed those who refused to convert, and used the full force of their military power to impose the new faith. This was not a gentle persuasion. It was a holy war waged by Scandinavians against other Scandinavians. For many, conversion was not a choice made in a moment of spiritual awakening, but a choice made with a sword at their throat. It was accept the cross, or meet a very real and unpleasant end. The old faith was decentralized, a collection of local traditions and beliefs. It had no single leader, no organized priesthood, no sacred text to rally around. It was a folk religion, and it was terribly vulnerable to an organized top-down assault by a king who had decided that the future was Christian. The conversion also offered a neat solution to the problem of succession. In the Old Norse system, any son of a king, legitimate or not, could make a claim to the throne, leading to endless civil wars. The Christian model of primogeniture, the firstborn son inherits all, was a much more stable, if less fair, way to pass on power. For a king looking to build a lasting dynasty, this was an incredibly attractive feature. So, you have this perfect storm, the lure of Christian wealth and trade, the social pressure of living among a Christian majority in settled lands, the immense political and diplomatic advantages for kings looking to build modern states, the relentless, often violent pressure from missionaries and Christian convert rulers, and a decentralized, disorganized folk religion that struggled to mount a unified defense. Piece by piece, kingdom by kingdom, the old world gave way. Denmark under Harald Bluetooth, then Norway under the two Olafs, and finally Sweden, the last holdout, which remained a battleground between pagans and Christians well into the 12th century. The temple at Uppsala, the great centre of Norse paganism, was finally destroyed around 1087. The bells began to chime where the horns once roared. But in our timeline, we're going to stop that process dead in its tracks. The year is 965 AD. In our history, this is roughly when Harald Bluetooth declares Denmark a Christian nation. In our alternate world, this is the year of the Great Refusal. The seeds of this refusal weren't planted in a single day, but have been growing for decades. The Vikings who settled abroad in the Danelaw and Normandy have been sending letters, or rather spoken messages carried by traders and kinsmen back home. These messages aren't just tales of wealth and land, they are warnings. They speak of a creeping cultural erosion, of sons who no longer know the great sagas, of communities where the local priest, not the Jarl, holds the real power. They talk of a faith that demands you turn the other cheek, a bizarre and dishonourable concept to a warrior society. They speak of sin, of shame, of a God who demands absolute obedience and a church that demands a tithe, a tenth of your hard-won earnings. To the fiercely independent farmers and chieftains of Scandinavia, this sounds less like salvation and more like spiritual slavery. The missionaries are here, of course. Men like Popo are travelling from village to village, preaching, debating, and attempting their miracles. But something is different this time. Instead of being met with a mix of curiosity and hostility, they are met with organised, well-reasoned theological opposition. The Norse have had a century to study this new faith from a distance. They've learned its arguments, its weaknesses, and its pressure points. When a missionary speaks of the singular, all-powerful Christian God, a local goddy, a pagan priest-chieftain, stands up and asks why this all-powerful God allows his own followers to be slaughtered and his churches to be plundered. When the missionary talks of the gentle, loving Jesus, the goddy counters with tales from the Old Testament, which his people have heard about from traders, tales full of a wrathful, jealous God who commands his people to commit genocide. Which one is your God? They ask. The lamb or the lion? You seem to bring us stories of both. The pivotal moment comes at the Thing, the Great Assembly. Let's place it at Uppsala in Sweden, the heart of the old faith. But similar scenes are playing out in the assemblies of Denmark and Norway. The king, let's call him Hakon the Defiant, is under immense pressure. Envoys from the Holy Roman Emperor are present, offering trade pacts, alliances, and recognition, with one non-negotiable condition: baptism. They make their case, speaking of a unified, peaceful Europe under one God. But then the chieftains and law speakers of the land have their say. An old, respected Jarl stands up. He doesn't shout. He speaks with the quiet authority of a man who has led raids and seen the world. He talks about the ancestors buried in the mounds that dot the landscape. They did not kneel to a foreign god, he says. They lived by the strength of their arms and the honour of their word. This new faith asks us to believe we are all born in sin, that our greatest deeds are worthless without their God's approval. I say my grandfather, who died with an axe in his hand, facing down 5 enemies, is not burning in some Christian hell. He is drinking with the gods in Valhalla. Are we to dishonour our dead by calling their lives a lie? This sentiment electrifies the assembly. It taps into a deep cultural nerve. The crucial historical fact here is the importance of ancestor veneration in Norse culture. Faith wasn't just about the gods in Asgard. It was about the continuation of the family line and honouring those who came before. Christianity, with its heaven and hell, effectively severed that link. It told you that your honourable pagan grandfather was damned. This was a profound personal insult that early missionaries consistently failed to grasp. The refusal is not a simple no. It is a carefully crafted counter-proposal, a masterpiece of Scandinavian pragmatism. This is where the practice of prim-signing, which we touched on earlier, becomes official policy. King Hakon stands before the imperial envoys and declares that his people will respect the Christian God in Christian lands. They will undergo the preliminary rites to allow for trade. They will not raid churches. They will be business partners. But the lands of the north will remain consecrated to the gods of the north. He declares that any missionary who attempts to preach or convert within his borders without permission will be treated as a foreign spy and a political agitator. The reaction is a mixture of shock and outrage from the Christian envoys. But they are powerless to do anything about it, right here, right now. They are deep in hostile territory. King Hakon, meanwhile, has brilliantly navigated the situation. He has not declared war. He has not insulted the Christian God directly. He has simply drawn a line in the snow. He has offered peace and trade, putting the onus on the Christian kingdoms. If they refuse to trade, they will be the ones seen as unreasonable and aggressive. A quirky, humanizing detail of this scene is the immediate aftermath. After the tense formal proceedings, the Norse celebrate with a great feast. They sacrifice a horse to Odin, its blood sprinkled on the walls of the hall and on the attendees, a ritual known as bloc. It is a deliberate, powerful, and joyous act of defiance. They are not just rejecting Christianity, they are passionately reaffirming their own faith in the most dramatic way possible. The jarls and kings of the other Scandinavian lands hear of this. They see that defiance is possible without immediate annihilation. The idea spreads like wildfire. In Denmark, Harold Bluetooth, instead of erecting the gelling stone to Christ, carves it with a triumphant image of Thor wrestling the Midgard serpent, dedicating his unification of the Danes to the strength of the old gods. In Norway, would-be Christianizing kings like Olaf Tryggvason find themselves without popular support. When they attempt to use violence to convert their people, they are overthrown and branded as tyrants trying to impose a foreign yoke. They are defeated not just by armies, but by a population that is now actively hostile to their message. The Great Refusal is complete. The window for a peaceful, top-down conversion has slammed shut. The North has made its choice, and in doing so, it has set itself on a collision course with the rest of Europe. The whispers of the cross have been silenced by the roar of the defiant horn, but a faith cannot survive on defiance alone. It must adapt, or it will die. With the doors to Christian Europe now partially closed, the Norse faith, for the first time in its history, is forced to look inward. It can no longer exist as a loose collection of local customs and oral traditions. It is now in a direct ideological struggle with a highly organised, text-based and relentlessly expansionist religion. To survive, it must evolve. What follows is not a reformation in the Christian sense. There is no single figure like Martin Luther nailing a list of grievances to a temple door, but something more organic, a slow and deliberate hardening of belief into doctrine. This is the era of the Hammer's Reformation. The first and most crucial step is the codification of their beliefs. The Godar, the priest chieftains, realise that their strength, the adaptability and local flavour of their faith, is also a critical weakness. Oral traditions can be forgotten, distorted, or slowly eroded by outside influence. They need a canon. Travelling scholars, who in our timeline would have become Christian monks, instead dedicate their lives to a different holy task. They journey across the vast Scandinavian world, from the fjords of Norway to the islands of the Baltic, collecting the old stories, the poems, the genealogies of the gods, and the magical charms. They are the Norse equivalent of the Brothers Grimm, but they are not collecting fairy tales, they're compiling scripture. The Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which in our world were written down by Christians like Snorri Sturluson centuries later as historical and literary artefacts, are in this timeline compiled much earlier. They become the sacred texts of the Reformed Norse faith. This act of writing them down is monumental. The crucial historical fact here is that literacy in Scandinavia was, until Christianization, almost exclusively based on the runic alphabet, which was used for short inscriptions, memorials and magical purposes, not for long-form literature. The Norse now adopt and adapt the Latin alphabet, not for praying to the Christian god, but for preserving the tales of their own. With texts come schools. Great centres of learning are established not in monasteries, but in fortified temple complexes. The greatest of these is at Uppsala, which is rebuilt and expanded into a true religious capital. Here, a new kind of priest is trained. They are not just ritual specialists who know how to perform the blot. They are theologians, debaters, historians and rune masters. They study the sacred texts, develop answers to the thorny questions posed by Christian missionaries, and learn the arts of rhetoric to defend their faith. A fascinating and quirky development within these schools is the formalization of Seder, the shamanistic magic traditionally practiced by women. While it was always powerful, it was also feared and seen as somewhat unmanly. Now, facing an external threat, it is re-evaluated. Theologians argue that Cider is a gift from Freya and Odin, a sacred tool for seeing the future and protecting the community. It becomes a respected branch of temple knowledge, with its own practitioners, both male and female, who advise kings and jarls. The Norse are essentially creating their own clergy, their own intellectual class, dedicated to the preservation and elaboration of their worldview. This new, organised paganism also begins to syncretize, borrowing and adapting ideas from its rivals to strengthen itself. This is a point that scholars of comparative religion often emphasize. Faiths in conflict rarely stay pure, they influence each other. The Norse theologians see the power of Christian congregational worship. While the blot remains the central dramatic ritual, they develop new, more regular community gatherings. These might involve the recitation of the great poems, like the Havamal, the sayings of the High One, where Odin gives advice on wisdom, conduct and hospitality. It becomes a sort of Norse sermon, reinforcing cultural values and community bonds. They also see the effectiveness of Christian charity and create their own systems of support for the poor and the widowed. framed not as Christian charity, but as upholding the Norse virtue of generosity and strengthening the bonds of kinship. The gods themselves undergo a subtle but important shift in emphasis. In a world now defined by a cold war with the Christian South, Thor's role as the great protector of Midgard becomes even more central. His hammer, Mjolnir, becomes the explicit symbol of Norse identity, a defiant answer to the cross. It is worn by everyone, carved onto buildings and stamped onto coins. Odin, too, takes on a new dimension. His relentless, painful quest for knowledge is held up as a model. To be a true follower of the All-Father is not just to be a warrior, but to be a seeker of wisdom, a poet, a scholar. This provides a spiritual justification for the new schools and the intellectual development of the faith. The faith becomes more philosophical, more capable of answering the big questions about life, death, and meaning that Christianity had previously monopolized. This reformed faith, which we can call Odinism, or the Fawn Cedar, old custom, is far more resilient than its earlier form. When a Christian missionary now arrives in a village, he doesn't just face a suspicious farmer, he faces a trained local priest who can debate him point for point, armed with a sacred text and a well-articulated theology. The faith now has an institutional backbone. It has a political wing, with the Godar and temple leaders advising kings on matters of state. It has an intellectual wing with its scholars and theologians, and it has a popular wing, with a laity whose faith is reinforced by regular community rituals and a powerful unifying symbol in the form of Thor's hammer. This is no longer a scattered folk belief. It is a church. The hammer's reformation has given the Norse world the tools it needed to resist assimilation. It has created a permanent, powerful and self-confident pagan state on the northern edge of Europe. This defiant pagan bloc will now permanently alter the destiny of its neighbours, starting with the island just across the North Sea, Britain. As the 10th century bleeds into the 11th, the most immediate consequence of the Great Refusal is felt across the water in England. In our history, the Danelaw, the sprawling territory in northern and eastern England governed by Norse laws and settled by Vikings, was a temporary phenomenon. Its Scandinavian inhabitants slowly but surely assimilated, converted to Christianity, and were absorbed into a unified English kingdom. But in this alternate world, that assimilation never happens. The Danelaw doesn't just endure, it hardens into a distinct political and cultural entity. It becomes England's pagan heart. The link between the Danelaw and Scandinavia is no longer just one of shared ancestry. It is now a bond of shared faith. The reformed, organised Odinism we just discussed flows across the North Sea. The temples, the trained priests, the sacred texts, all of it is exported to the Norse towns of Jorvik, modern York, Lincoln and Leicester. Jorvik, which was already a major Viking trade hub, now becomes the religious capital of pagan Britain, a sister city to Uppsala. A great temple to Thor is built where, in our timeline, York Minster would eventually stand. The border between the Danelaw and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south and west is no longer just a political line. It is a sharp religious and cultural frontier, a microcosm of the larger divide between pagan Scandinavia and Christian Europe. This creates a permanent state of tension. The Anglo-Saxon kings, devout Christians like Ethelred the Unready, cannot tolerate a thriving, self-confident pagan state on their own island. It is an existential threat and a spiritual insult. In our history, Ethelred ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, a brutal killing of Danish settlers. In this timeline, such an act is not just a massacre, it is an act of war against the entire unified Norse world. When news of the slaughter of Odin's men in England reaches the courts of Denmark and Norway, the reaction is swift and furious. It is seen not as a political move, but as a religiously motivated atrocity. The great heathen army of old is reborn, but this time it is not just a coalition of raiders seeking plunder. It is a crusade in reverse. Fleets from Norway, Denmark, and the Norse settlements in Ireland and Scotland converge on England not merely to avenge a massacre, but to protect and expand the lands of their faith. The resulting wars are far more brutal and ideologically charged than the conflicts of our timeline. For the Anglo-Saxons, it is a holy war to reclaim their land for Christ. For the Norse, it is a fight for the survival of their people and their gods. The crucial historical fact to consider here is the military reality of the 11th century. The Vikings were still a formidable military power, and now they are unified by a common cause. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, often fractious and disunited, struggle to mount a coordinated defence. Over several decades of bitter fighting, the Danelaw doesn't just survive, it expands. The border is pushed further south and west. The Kingdom of Mercia is fractured, its eastern half absorbed into the pagan sphere. London becomes a tense, divided frontier city, with a Christian west and a pagan east, much like Berlin during the Cold War. The cultural impact on England is profound. Two distinct forms of Englishness develop. In the south, a devoutly Christian, Anglo-Saxon culture continues, looking towards Rome and mainland Europe for its identity. In the north and east, a vibrant, syncretic Anglo-Norse culture flourishes. The Old English language becomes heavily infused with Old Norse to an even greater degree than in our world. A new literature is born, one that blends Anglo-Saxon poetic forms with the myths and legends of the Norse gods. Imagine epic poems written not about Beowulf fighting Grendel, but about an Anglo-Norse hero fighting alongside Thor against the giants. A quirky, humanising detail of this divided England would be the evolution of simple things like names. In the south, you have traditional Anglo-Saxon names like Edward and Edith. In the north, you have Norse names like Eric, Ingrid, and Hakon, which remain mainstream instead of becoming historical curiosities. The very sound of the English people would be different depending on which side of the religious border you stood. The political landscape is shattered. The dream of a single, unified England is dead. Instead, the island is split into two major powers, the Christian kingdom of Wessex in the south and the powerful pagan Northumbrian Danelaw state in the north, which is part of a larger federation with Scandinavia. This changes everything for the future of Britain. The constant threat from the pagan north forces Wessex to become more militarised, more insular, and even more fanatically Christian. There is no room for the kind of cultural flowering that occurred in the late Anglo-Saxon period of our history. All resources are poured into defence. The scholarly debate about the extent of Scandinavian influence on English law and governance is settled in this timeline. In the Danelaw, the Thing Assembly remains the core of local government, fostering a fiercely democratic and decentralised political tradition that stands in stark contrast to the increasingly feudal, top-down system of Christian Wessex. This divided England is a powder keg, but it also creates a strange kind of stability. Neither side is strong enough to completely conquer the other. They are locked in a tense, ideological stalemate. This enduring pagan heartland in Britain acts as a vital bridge for the Norse world, a permanent foothold in Western Europe. It ensures that the Norse are not isolated on their northern peninsula. They are a constant, unavoidable presence at the very centre of European affairs, and it means that when a certain duke from Normandy looks across the Channel in the year 1066, he sees a very, very different strategic picture. The stage is set for a completely different kind of conquest, or none at all. While the hammer and the cross clash over the fate of Britain, another great spiritual drama is unfolding far to the east, along the sprawling river roads that connect the Baltic to the Black Sea. This is the land of the Rus, a territory populated by Slavic tribes, but ruled by a Viking elite who had sailed their longships down the Dnieper and the Volga. In our history, these Norse-descended rulers, based in their capital of Kiev, made a fateful choice. In 988, Grand Prince Vladimir the Great, after supposedly sending emissaries to investigate the major religions of the world, chose to adopt Byzantine Orthodox Christianity. This decision tethered the future of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus to Constantinople, shaping the cultural, artistic and political destiny of Eastern Europe for 1,000 years. But in a world where the Scandinavian homeland has defiantly rejected the cross, this eastern path is never taken. The Rus rulers in Kiev, men like Vladimir, are in constant contact with their kinsmen back in the old country. They hear not of conversions and baptisms, but of the great refusal, the Hammer's Reformation, and the creation of a powerful, confident Norse pagan identity. The political logic that pushed Vladimir towards Christianity in our timeline is now inverted. To align with Constantinople would be to betray his own ancestors and to alienate himself from the dynamic, unified pagan bloc in the north, which is his primary source of military recruits and high-status trade goods. The Byzantine missionaries who arrive in Kiev find themselves debating not just a primitive pagan prince, but one who is backed by the sophisticated new theology coming out of Uppsala. He is no longer an easy mark. Vladimir, or a figure like him, still understands the need for a unifying state religion for his vast and diverse realm. A loose collection of Slavic folk beliefs and Norse gods is not enough to bind together a sprawling empire of dozens of different tribes. But instead of importing a foreign faith, he follows the model of Hakon the Defiant and the kings of the north. He initiates a religious project that is both conservative and radically new. The creation of a distinct Rus-Slavic paganism. The crucial historical fact here is that the pre-Christian beliefs of the Eastern Slavs already had a pantheon of gods, such as the thunder god Perun and the sun god Dazbog, who had striking similarities to Norse gods like Thor and Freya. This provides a fertile ground for syncretism. Vladimir doesn't just impose the Norse pantheon, he intelligently merges it with the local Slavic one. A great temple is built on the hills overlooking Kiev. In our history, Vladimir erected statues to the Slavic gods here before his conversion, which he then dramatically tore down. In this timeline, he reinforces them. But now Thor stands beside Perun, the two thunder gods sharing a place of honour. Odin, the god of rulers and wisdom, is given primacy as the patron of the Grand Prince and his warrior elite, the Druzhina. Freya might be merged with Makosh, a major Slavic mother goddess. This isn't a simple replacement of one set of gods with another. It's a careful, politically astute fusion. The state religion becomes a two-tiered system. The ruling Norse elite continue their Odinic practices, while the Slavic populace is encouraged to see their traditional gods as aspects of, or partners to, the now dominant Norse pantheon. This respects local traditions while cementing the authority of the Norse-descended ruling class. A quirky, humanizing tidbit of this new religious landscape would be the art it produces. Instead of the solemn, stylized icons of Orthodox Christianity, the art of the Kievan Rus would be a vibrant, dynamic fusion of Norse and Slavic styles. Imagine intricate wood carvings depicting scenes from the Eddas, but with the distinctive swirling patterns of Slavic folk art. Instead of onion domes, the great temples might feature dramatic dragon-headed rooflines, reminiscent of a Norse stave church. The epic poems of the Rus, the Bylini, would tell tales not of Christian saints, but of Slavic bogatyr heroes fighting alongside Norse Einherjar in the service of the gods of Kiev. The long-term consequences are immense. Eastern Europe is not drawn into the orbit of the Byzantine Empire. Instead, a third great power bloc emerges, one that is culturally and religiously distinct from both Latin Christendom in the west and Orthodox Christendom in the southeast. The Rus state, or the Kievan Federation as we might call it, aligns itself firmly with pagan Scandinavia. This creates a massive, contiguous pagan territory stretching from the North Sea across the Baltic and down to the shores of the Black Sea. The historical rivalry between Poland, which would likely remain staunchly Catholic as a bulwark against this pagan superstate, and the Rus would become an even more bitter and enduring holy war. The Great Schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, a defining feature of European history, is overshadowed by a much larger schism, that between a unified Christian Europe and this vast, powerful pagan empire. This pagan Rus also looks in different directions for trade and expansion, while the link to Constantinople becomes one of wary rivalry, rather than spiritual kinship. The trade routes down the Volga to the Caspian Sea and the Islamic world of the caliphates become even more important. Arab travellers and chroniclers like Ibn Fadlan, who in our timeline gave a famously disgusted account of a Rus ship funeral, would be followed by generations of traders and diplomats engaging with a mature, powerful pagan state. There would be no religious barrier to trade with the Muslim world, only a pragmatic one. In fact, the pagan Rus and the caliphates might find themselves to be occasional allies, united by their shared opposition to the aggressive expansion of the Byzantine and Latin Christian spheres. The entire geopolitical and religious map of Europe is redrawn. The West has a hostile pagan Britain on its doorstep. The Southeast has a hostile pagan Rus empire. And caught in the middle, the Christian kingdoms of Europe are about to find their own holy wars taking a very, very different turn. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the patience of Christian Europe has run out. The Great Refusal was an insult. The creation of a formal, organised pagan church was a threat. The existence of a hostile pagan Danelaw in England and a sprawling Rus pagan empire in the east is an intolerable crisis. The popes in Rome, who in our timeline were beginning to channel the aggressive piety of the knightly class towards the Holy Land, now have a much more immediate and arguably more dangerous enemy. The infidel isn't just in faraway Jerusalem, he is in York, in Kiev, and his longships are once again raiding the coasts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, not just for plunder, but as part of a low-grade, ongoing religious war. The age of the Northern Crusades begins, but on a scale and with a ferocity that dwarfs the historical Baltic Crusades against minor Prussian and Lithuanian tribes. This is not a sideshow. This is the main event. The papacy issues a series of bulls, formal proclamations, that equate the fight against the Odin's men of the north with the fight against the Saracens in the east. Knights who take up the cross to fight in the cold forests of Scandinavia or the marshlands of the Danelaw are promised the same remission of sins as those who travel to Outremer. This is a crucial turning point. The military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and most significantly, a newly formed order we might call the Knights of the Sword of St. Michael, or the Order of the Northern Cross, are given vast tracts of land along the pagan frontier and tasked with waging perpetual war. The historical Teutonic Knights, who carved out a state in Prussia, become the model for a much larger continent-spanning military effort. The frontier between Christian and pagan Europe becomes a brutal militarized zone. In Germany and Poland, massive castles are built, facing off against the fortified temple complexes of the Norse. The Elbe River, which once marked a border with Slavic tribes, now becomes a new Rhine, a heavily defended line against the Danish pagan kingdom. In Britain, the Anglo-Saxon kings of Wessex, bankrolled by papal funds and reinforced by knightly orders from across Europe, launch relentless campaigns to push back the Danelaw. The fighting here is particularly bitter. It's not just a war between kingdoms, it's a civil war on a grand scale, pitting Christian Britain against pagan Britain. The rolling hills of Mercia become a blood-soaked no-man's land, dotted with the ruins of monasteries and pagan shrines, a landscape of permanent grinding warfare. The nature of this warfare is different from the Crusades in the Holy Land. There, the goal was to capture and hold specific holy sites. Here, the goal is conversion or annihilation. The crucial historical fact is that under the developing canon law of the time, war against pagans had fewer rules than war between Christians. The concept of just war was applied far more loosely. Papal legates accompanying the Crusader armies preach that to kill a heathen is not homicide, but malicide, the killing of evil itself. This theological justification leads to horrific atrocities. Entire villages are wiped out. Captured Godar are publicly and theatrically executed. Sacred groves are chopped down and burned, and churches are built on the ashes as a symbol of triumph. But the Norse and their Rus allies are not the disorganized tribes of our history's Baltic Crusades. They are fighting on their home turf, in a climate and terrain they know intimately. They are unified by their reformed faith, which now has a rich martyrology of its own, sagas and songs about heroes who died fighting the southern invaders. A quirky, humanizing detail of their defense would be the role of the Skjaldmare, the shield maiden. While their historical existence is debated, in a society now locked in a century-long existential war, the idea of women fighting to defend their homes and their faith would not just be a myth, it would become a necessity and a celebrated reality. Tales of shield maiden commanders holding a fjord pass or defending a temple would become powerful recruitment tools, a stark contrast to the more circumscribed roles for women in the Christian world. The Northern Crusades become a black hole for European resources and manpower. For generations, the younger sons of French, German, and Italian nobles, who might have gone to seek their fortunes in Sicily or Syria, instead take the cross for the Northern Front. This has a profound, if unintended, consequence. It bleeds the Crusades in the Middle East of their most zealous and experienced fighters. The Crusader states in Outremer, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, are much weaker and more precarious as a result. While one part of Christendom is locked in a death struggle with the pagan north, the other is struggling to hold on against the forces of Islam. The scholarly debate over whether the Crusades were primarily driven by piety or greed is complicated in this timeline. Here, the Northern Crusades are clearly a war of survival and expansion, but they are also a massive economic enterprise. The military orders become incredibly wealthy, not just from donations, but from the vast lands they conquer and the trade routes they seek to control. This constant grinding warfare changes both sides. The Christian kingdoms on the frontier become harsh, militaristic and intolerant societies, defined by their opposition to the pagan other. The pagan Norse world in turn becomes more insular, more suspicious of outsiders, and more reliant on its warrior ethos. The optimistic, outward-looking spirit of the early Viking Age, the spirit of the explorer and the trader, is slowly replaced by the grim determination of the defender. The longship, once a tool of exploration and commerce, becomes almost exclusively a weapon of war. The dream of a peaceful coexistence, envisioned in the Great Refusal's compromise of trade not conversion, has died in a blaze of crusading fervour. Europe is now split by a curtain of iron and faith, a bloody frontier that will define its politics, culture and soul for centuries to come. In a world carved in two by a new religious schism, the flow of silver and goods becomes as contested as the flow of souls. The Northern Crusades are not just a war of faith, they are an economic war. Christian Europe, led by the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, attempts to impose a total economic blockade on the pagan north. Papal decrees forbid Christian merchants from trading with the unbelievers in vital strategic goods, weapons, iron, even the timber needed to build their iconic longships. The great trading hubs of the south, like Venice and Genoa, are ordered to shun the pagan bloc. The goal is simple: to starve the Norse and Rus of the resources they need to fight and the luxury goods that sustain the loyalty of their warrior elites. If they cannot be defeated by the sword, perhaps they can be broken by the purse. But this strategy backfires spectacularly. Instead of collapsing, the pagan world reorients its entire economic existence. The crucial historical fact here is the geographic position of the Norse and Rus. They sit astride some of the most important trade routes of the medieval world, the great river roads that connect the Baltic to the Black and Caspian seas. While the door to Christian Europe is now heavily guarded, the doors to the east and the southeast remain wide open. The Norse, legendary sailors and merchants, simply turn their ships around. The trade that once flowed west now thunders east. The pagan city of Kiev, a fusion of Norse and Slavic culture, explodes in wealth and size, becoming a new Constantinople, the true crossroads of the world. It becomes the western terminus of the Silk Road, a place where silks from China, spices from India and silver from the Abbasid Caliphate are traded for the goods of the north. High-quality furs, amber, walrus ivory, honey, wax and, most grimly, slaves captured in the endless border wars with the Christian kingdoms of Poland and Germany. This reorientation forges a powerful and unlikely de facto alliance. The pagan Norse-Rus bloc and the major Islamic caliphates, the Abbasids in Baghdad and later the Fatimids in Cairo, become primary economic partners. They are united by a common enemy, the aggressive and expansionist Christian powers of both Rome and Constantinople. Norse merchants, once a rare sight in the markets of Baghdad, are now a common presence. A fascinating, quirky detail of this interaction would be the emergence of a pidgin language, a blend of Old Norse and Arabic used by traders from the Dnieper to the Tigris. Norse runic inscriptions would be found carved into the walls of caravanserais deep in Central Asia, and Islamic dirhams would become the standard currency in Scandinavia, far more common than the deniers and pennies of the Christian West. There would be no religious compunction about this trade. The Norse see the Muslims not as fellow believers, but as pragmatic, powerful business partners. The Muslims, in turn, view the Odinsmen of the north as a useful buffer state, a hammer of the infidels that keeps the Christians of Europe distracted and divided. The economic isolation of the north also forces a surge in domestic innovation. Cut off from the iron mines of Central Europe, the Norse are forced to perfect their own steel-making techniques, perhaps rediscovering and improving upon methods for creating high-quality crucible steel, similar to the legendary Ulfbert swords of our own history. Denied French wine, they become master brewers of ale and mead, turning their potent drinks into a valuable export commodity in their own right. Their shipbuilding, already legendary, evolves. While the classic dragon-headed longship remains their primary warship, they also develop larger, more robust cargo vessels, Nars, specifically designed for the long, arduous journeys across the Black Sea and for navigating the treacherous coastal waters of the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Christian economic blockade springs leaks. The allure of profit is a powerful solvent for religious piety. The merchants of northern Italian city-states, officially loyal to the Pope, secretly run the blockade, sending their ships into the Baltic under false flags to trade for the priceless furs and amber they cannot get elsewhere. This creates a shadow economy, an immense tension within Christendom. The papacy constantly rails against these profiteers of heresy, but struggles to enforce its own embargo. The most significant leak, however, is the Danelaw. The pagan kingdom in northern England becomes the great commercial loophole. It is geographically close to the Christian kingdoms of France and Flanders, and its merchants, a mix of Norse and Anglo-Saxon heritage, are masters at playing both sides. They trade openly with their pagan brethren in Scandinavia, while simultaneously conducting clandestine high-profit trade with their Christian neighbours just across the border, creating a massive black market that enriches the Danelaw and undermines the crusading effort. The ultimate result of this attempted isolation is the creation of two parallel and competing global trade networks. One is the traditional Mediterranean-centric network dominated by the Italian city-states and connected to the Christian kingdoms of Europe. The other is a massive, powerful network running from the North Atlantic through the Baltic and the Rus River systems and connecting to the Islamic world in the Far East. The centre of economic gravity in Europe shifts. In our world, it moved south to the Mediterranean. In this timeline, it is split, with a vibrant, powerful northern pole centred on the pagan cities of Jorvik, Uppsala, and Kiev. This economic strength fuels the pagan war machine, funds the construction of their great temples, and ensures their cultural and political independence. Christian Europe's attempt to isolate and impoverish its northern rival has failed. It has instead created a richer, more resilient, and more globally connected enemy. The year is 1066, a date etched into the memory of every English schoolchild. In our history, it is the year of the Norman Conquest, a pivotal moment that irrevocably shaped the English language, its government, its class structure, and its relationship with continental Europe. It was the year England was conquered by French-speaking descendants of Vikings who had converted to Christianity. But in the world we're exploring, the very concept of Norman as we know it doesn't exist. The Great Refusal means there is no Christianized Normandy. The Duchy of Normandy is still just a Norse colony on the French coast, a semi-independent pagan lordship spiritually and politically aligned with the Scandinavian bloc, not with the King of France or the Pope in Rome. And this single profound change means that 1066 and all that never was. The crisis of 1066 still happens. The childless King of England, Edward the Confessor, still dies in January, creating a succession crisis. The contenders for the throne are still there, but their identities and circumstances are radically different. The claimant Harold Godwinson, an Anglo-Saxon nobleman, is still a major player, but he is not the Harold of our timeline. He is Harold of Wessex, the leader of the staunchly Christian southern English kingdom, a man whose entire life has been defined by the struggle against the pagan Danelaw to the north. His claim to the throne of a united England is really a declaration of his intent to launch a final, decisive crusade to eradicate paganism from the island. Then there is the invader from the north. In our world, it was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a final brilliant flash of the old Viking age. In this timeline, he is not just a lone adventurer seeking a crown. He is Harald Hardrada, the High King of the North Sea Empire, a confederation that includes Norway, Denmark, and the English Danelaw. His invasion is not a gamble, it is the culmination of a century of struggle. He's not just trying to win a kingdom, he's fighting to secure the future of the Anglo-Norse people and their faith. His army is not just Norwegian, it is a grand pagan host, with contingents from the Danelaw, from the Norse settlements in Ireland, and even from Sweden. And what of the third great claimant, William the Conqueror? He simply isn't a factor. William, Duke of Normandy, is in this world known as Jarl William of Rouen. He is a powerful pagan lord, yes, but he is a vassal of the French king in name only, and a bitter enemy of the Christian establishment. The Pope would no more bless his invasion of Christian Wessex than he would bless an invasion by the devil himself. William's primary concerns are the endless border wars with his French neighbours, and his own complex relationship with the High King in Scandinavia. He has no claim to the English throne, and no interest in fighting for it. The historical justification for his invasion, a supposed promise from King Edward, is meaningless in a world where Edward is the leader of the opposing faith. So, the great three-way contest of 1066 becomes a two-way slugging match, a straightforward clash of civilizations fought on English soil. Harald Hardrada lands in the north, not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator and leader, welcomed by the Anglo-Norse of the Danelaw. His army is swelled by local levies. Harold of Wessex, instead of having to famously march his army north and then south, only has to march north. The crucial historical fact is that the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold Godwinson defeated Harold Hardrada in our history, either doesn't happen or has a very different outcome. Without the need for a forced march and with the addition of Danelaw troops, the pagan army is larger, better rested, and fighting on friendly terrain. It is entirely plausible that they defeat the Christian army of Wessex in a great battle near York. Let's imagine that is exactly what happens. Harold Hardrada is crowned King of all England in Jorvik, not London. The pagan faith, Odinism, is declared the official religion of the entire kingdom. The history of England is permanently derailed. There is no Norman Conquest. There is no injection of French language and feudal law. The English language continues to evolve on its Germanic Norse track, sounding much more like Frisian or Dutch to our modern ears. The rigid feudal system imposed by the Normans never arrives. Instead, the more democratic, decentralized legal system of the Danelaw, based on the thing and the judgment of one's peers, is extended across the whole country. The English aristocracy is not wiped out and replaced by a foreign elite. The Anglo-Norse lords of the north and the surviving Anglo-Saxon thanes of the south are integrated into a new power structure under their pagan Scandinavian king. The long-term cultural impact is immense. England is culturally and politically severed from Catholic Europe. It is now the westernmost pillar of the great pagan northern bloc. A quirky, humanizing detail of this New England would be its calendar. Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter are replaced by the pagan festivals of Yule and Ostara, celebrated with the old rituals. The very rhythm of daily life would be different, tied to the seasons and the feasts of the Norse gods. The great Gothic cathedrals, Canterbury, Lincoln, Salisbury, are never built. Instead, the landscape is dominated by magnificent wooden temple halls, their gables carved with the interlocking beasts of Norse art. England's entire architectural and artistic heritage is completely different. This event sends shockwaves across Christendom. The complete loss of England is a catastrophe far greater than the loss of a distant Crusader state in Syria. It is a strategic nightmare. The pagan bloc now has a secure, wealthy and populous base right on the shores of the English Channel, within striking distance of France and the Low Countries. The Northern Crusades, which were already a desperate struggle, now seem almost hopeless. The resources of England, its wealth and its manpower, are now turned against Christendom. This alternate 1066 doesn't just change the fate of one island, it solidifies the great civilizational divide and ensures that the conflict between the hammer and the cross will define the future of Europe for centuries to come, with the forces of the old gods now stronger than ever. The loss of England in 1066 and the consolidation of a powerful pagan bloc across the north sends a tremor of panic through the heart of Christian Europe. The papacy, under a series of reforming and increasingly assertive popes like Gregory VII, finds itself facing an existential crisis on two fronts. To the southeast, the Seljuk Turks are threatening the Byzantine Empire and restricting pilgrim access to the Holy Land. To the north, a far more immediate and arguably more dangerous foe is now lodged permanently in England, threatening the very core of Christendom. This forces a terrible strategic choice upon the leaders of the Christian world. Where do you direct your holy warriors? Where is the threat most dire? The result is a deeply and fatally diverted holy war. In our timeline, Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095 was a masterstroke of political and religious propaganda, channeling the violent energies of the European knightly class towards a single distant goal, the liberation of Jerusalem. In this alternate world, the speech at Clermont has a very different tone and a divided message. The Pope cannot ignore the plight of the Eastern Christians, but he also cannot ignore the pleas for help from the King of France, whose coastline is now being raided by the Anglo-Norse, or from the Holy Roman Emperor, who is fighting a losing battle against the pagan Danes and Rus. The call to crusade is split. Aid is, knights are still encouraged to go to the Holy Land, but an equally pious and perhaps more urgent path to salvation is offered, fighting the pagan in the north. Deus vult, God wills it, is still the cry, but it now echoes in two different directions. The consequence is that neither crusade receives the full, overwhelming force of a united Christendom. The first crusade to the Holy Land, which in our history was a stunning if brutal success, becomes a much more fraught and uncertain affair. The crucial historical fact is that many of the key leaders of the First Crusade were Normans from both Normandy and southern Italy, men like Bohemond of Taranto and Tancred. In this world, the Normans of Normandy are pagan enemies of the Crusade, and the Normans of Italy are likely far more concerned with threats closer to home. A significant portion of the most experienced and aggressive warriors from northern France, Flanders and Germany, who formed the backbone of the historical crusade, now divert their energies to the Northern Crusades. The expedition that eventually reaches the Levant is smaller, less experienced, and less well led. It might still achieve some initial successes due to the disunity of the Seljuk Turks, but it is highly unlikely they could capture and hold Jerusalem. Perhaps they managed to carve out a smaller crusader state around Antioch or Tripoli, but the grand prize remains firmly in Muslim hands. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the central achievement of the First Crusade, is never born. This has enormous repercussions. The driving impetus for the subsequent crusades is removed. There is no Jerusalem to defend or recapture. The great military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers still exist, but their primary focus and headquarters are forced to be in the north, fighting the pagan menace. A quirky, humanizing detail of this reality would be the pilgrimage routes. While some brave souls might still attempt the perilous journey to the Holy Land, for the average Christian in Northern Europe, the ultimate pilgrimage would be to the war-torn frontiers of the Danelaw or Poland, to visit the shrine of a knight martyred by the pagans. The geography of faith itself is altered. This diversion of resources becomes a permanent feature of European politics for the next 2 centuries. Every time a new crusade is called, kings and nobles must weigh their options. Do they send their knights on the long, expensive and increasingly futile journey to the east? Or do they use them to shore up the collapsing defences against the pagan north, which is a direct threat to their own lands and people? For a French or German ruler, the choice is obvious. The pagan threat is real, present, and breathing down their necks. The result is a chronic weakening of the Christian presence in the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire, receiving less aid from the West, is likely to fall much earlier to Turkish attacks. The dream of a Christian reconquest of the Holy Land withers and dies, not with a bang, but with a whimper, as resources and attention are continuously siphoned off to the Northern Front. The scholarly debate about the success or failure of the Crusades is rendered moot. In this timeline, they are an undeniable failure on the Eastern Front. But what about the North? Here, the diverted Holy War creates a permanent, grinding stalemate. The immense influx of crusading knights prevents the pagan kingdoms from completely overrunning northern Germany or the rest of France, but they are not strong enough to achieve their own goal of rolling back paganism. The frontier hardens into a landscape of perpetual low-intensity warfare, punctuated by massive bloody campaigns that achieve little but fill the graveyards. This constant state of war has a brutalizing effect on European society. The ideals of chivalry, which in our world were complex and often contradictory, become simplified into a harsh, binary code: Christian knight versus pagan foe. There is little room for the courtly love and romance of our timeline's chivalric literature. The epic poems are not about Lancelot and Guinevere. They're grim, bloody tales of fighting trolls and berserkers in the dark forests of the north. The papacy's power is paradoxically both enhanced and diminished. It is enhanced because it is the central organising force in a Europe-wide existential struggle, but it is diminished because it consistently fails to achieve a decisive victory on either front. The Pope's calls for crusade begin to sound like the desperate pleas of a leader who is losing a war on 2 fronts. The immense cost in blood and treasure, with little to show for it, leads to cynicism and dissent within Christendom. The diverted Holy War has not saved Christendom. It has bled it white, leaving it weakened, divided, and trapped between 2 powerful, unyielding enemies. For centuries, the Roman Catholic Church was the undisputed custodian of knowledge in Western Europe. Its monasteries were the libraries, its monks the scribes, and its theology the framework through which all of reality, from the movement of the stars to the purpose of human life, was understood. But in a world with a powerful, intellectually vibrant and non-Christian North, this monopoly on thought is shattered. The survival of a sophisticated paganism doesn't just change the map of faith, it fundamentally alters the development of science, philosophy and learning. It plants a different seed in the intellectual soil of Europe, one that might just blossom into a very different, and perhaps earlier, form of enlightenment. This is the story of the Tree of Knowledge, Yggdrasil, standing as a rival to the Tree of Life. The process begins in the reformed pagan schools of Uppsala, Jorvik and Kiev. As we discussed, These institutions were founded to create a theology that could stand up to Christian arguments. But to do that, they couldn't rely on faith alone. They had to engage with logic, rhetoric, and natural philosophy. In their quest to understand and explain their own cosmology, the world tree, the realms of gods and giants, the cosmic serpent, they are forced to become observers of the natural world. Astronomy, for instance, isn't just about calculating the date of Easter. It's about navigating the seas, understanding the seasons for planting and raiding, and perhaps discerning the will of the gods in the celestial movements. Their approach is more practical, more empirical, less burdened by the need to make every observation fit into a pre-existing divine revelation from a single holy book. The crucial historical fact here is the role of Arabic and Greek knowledge. In our timeline, the great works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Muslim scholars like Averroes and Avicenna flowed into Europe primarily through Christian Spain and Sicily, where they were translated and interpreted by churchmen to be compatible with Catholic doctrine. In this alternate world, there is another, more direct pipeline. This knowledge flows north along the pagan trade routes, from the caliphates, up the river roads, to Kiev and across the Baltic. The pagan scholars of the north receive these texts without the filter of Christian theology. They read Aristotle not as a forerunner to be reconciled with Saint Augustine, but as a brilliant philosopher in his own right. They are interested in his logic and his observations of nature, not in how to make his unmoved mover compatible with the God of Abraham. This creates a more secular, or at least a less dogmatic, philosophical tradition. This leads to a fascinating divergence in scientific development. Let's take medicine. While Christian medicine was often a mixture of prayer, superstition, and remnants of Galenic theory, the Norse pagan tradition, with its emphasis on practical results, would be more open to empirical methods. A quirky, humanizing detail might be the role of the cedar practitioners, the pagan magic users. In their search for potent herbs for potions and charms, they become expert botanists and apothecaries. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, forms the basis of a practical pharmacopoeia. When this folk knowledge is combined with the more systematic medical texts arriving from the Islamic world, it creates a powerful and effective medical tradition that stands in stark contrast to the often ineffective practices of the Christian South. A pagan doctor might be more likely to trust a poultice that has been observed to work than a prayer to a saint. The scholarly debate on the so-called medieval mind and its supposed closing by religion is given new life. In this world, you have a direct large-scale comparison. In the South, you have a sacred science, where philosophy and inquiry are the handmaidens of theology. In the North, you have what we might call a profane science, where knowledge is a tool for power, navigation, wealth, and understanding the world as it is. This doesn't mean the pagans are all enlightened atheists, far from it. They see their scientific inquiries as a way of understanding the intricate workings of the world created by the gods, of tracing the branches and roots of Yggdrasil. But they do not believe that a single book contains all the answers. The Havamal, one of their core texts, celebrates the endless search for knowledge, a core value of Odin himself. This creates an intellectual culture that values curiosity and questioning over blind faith. This different intellectual climate could lead to an earlier Renaissance, or scientific revolution, but one with a distinctly northern character. It might be less focused on the fine arts and humanism of the Italian Renaissance, and more focused on engineering, metallurgy, shipbuilding, and natural philosophy. The development of technologies like the printing press, for instance, might happen here first, not to print Bibles, but to mass-produce the Eddas, runic calendars, and practical manuals on navigation and farming. The university system, a creation of the medieval church in our world, would have a rival model, the great temple schools of the north, which would teach not just theology but also law, medicine, runic law and natural philosophy, all within a pagan framework. This intellectual divergence would be a source of both fear and fascination for the Christian world. The north would be seen as a place of dangerous, godless knowledge, a land of sorcerers and alchemists who have gained forbidden power by turning their backs on God. Yet, at the same time, the obvious practical successes of their science, their superior ships, their more effective medicine, their advanced metalwork, would be undeniable. Christian scholars might secretly travel north to study at the pagan schools, just as European scholars once travelled to the Islamic centres of learning in Toledo and Cordoba. The tree of knowledge, nurtured in the pagan north, would grow twisted and strange in the eyes of the south, but its fruits, practical, powerful, and world-altering, would be impossible to ignore. It offers a different path to modernity, one forged in the crucible of pagan curiosity rather than Christian revelation. Around the year 1000, long before the Great Refusal and the hardening of the pagan north, a small group of Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and landed on the shores of a new world. In our history they called it Vinland. They established a small, short-lived settlement, a mere footnote in the grand saga of exploration, which was soon abandoned and forgotten for almost 500 years. The reasons for this failure were numerous. Hostile natives, the Skrillings, a long and treacherous supply line, and a lack of compelling incentive from the Christian monarchies of a newly consolidating Scandinavia. But in a world where the Norse spirit remains unbent and their horizons boundless, Vinland's saga does not end in failure. It becomes the opening chapter of a new permanent history. In the centuries following the Great Refusal, the pagan north is under constant pressure from the crusading south. While they hold their own, the endless warfare creates a powerful push factor. For a young jarl with limited prospects, or a farmer whose lands have been repeatedly ravaged by border conflicts, the tales of a vast, open and unsettled land to the west sound like a promise of freedom and opportunity. The journey is perilous, but it is a concrete alternative to a life of perpetual conflict. The pull factor is just as strong. The reformed pagan faith, with its reverence for exploration and its lack of a centralized controlling monarchy that dictates colonial policy, encourages individual initiative. There is no king to grant a charter or a pope to draw a line on a map. If you can build a ship, gather a crew and brave the ocean, the land is yours for the taking. The crucial historical fact that changes everything is the development of more advanced shipbuilding. Driven by the economic boom of their eastern trade and the need for more durable warships, the Norse of this timeline continue to innovate. They develop the next generation of the Nar, the robust cargo ship. These new Finknars are larger, with deeper hulls capable of carrying more livestock, grain and settlers. They are better rigged, perhaps borrowing ideas seen on Arab dhows in the Black Sea, making them more capable of handling the brutal challenges of the North Atlantic. The trickle of explorers becomes a steady stream of settlers. The first permanent settlements are established not just in Newfoundland, but further south, along the coast of what we would call New England, where the climate is milder and the growing season longer. These new communities are a pure distillation of the pagan Norse culture. They are organised around a local jarl and a thing assembly, where all free landholders have a say. They build small wooden temples to Thor and Odin, and their first priority after building a longhouse is to establish a sacred grove. A quirky, humanising detail of this new society would be its names. The rivers, hills and settlements are given Norse names that reflect their new reality. A river teeming with fish might be named Laxar, Salmon River. A settlement founded in a beautiful green valley might be called Grenadala, Greendale. The very map of North America would speak with a Scandinavian accent. The relationship with the native populations, the Skrillings, is complex and fraught, but develops differently than the European colonization of our timeline. The Norse are not driven by a divine mandate to convert the savages. They view the natives not as soulless heathens to be saved, but as another tribe, another people to be traded with, fought with, or avoided. There is conflict, to be sure, often brutal, but there is also trade and a degree of cultural exchange. The Norse, coming from a harsh land, are adept at adapting. They learn from the natives about local crops like maize and squash, and about hunting techniques suited to this new world. Over generations, a unique hybrid culture begins to emerge in the border zones, and intermarriage, while not common, is not seen as a religious taboo. The scholarly debate over the nature of first contact is transformed here from a story of conquest and disease into a much more complicated saga of coexistence, conflict, and slow, unwilling integration. The existence of a permanent growing Norse presence in North America, let's call the whole territory Markland or Greater Vinland, has world-shattering implications. By the time Christian Europe is ready for its own age of exploration in the late 1400s, it is already too late. When Columbus, or his equivalent, sails west, he does not discover a new world. He bumps into the established western frontier of the old pagan Norse world. The shock would be immense. Instead of finding primitive tribes that can be easily subjugated, the Spanish and Portuguese find organised, iron-wielding, seafaring pagan states with a population of mixed Norse and native ancestry who have had centuries to adapt to American diseases and who view the newcomers with hostility and suspicion. The race to colonise the Americas becomes another front in the Great Holy War. The Spanish conquistadors, fresh from their Reconquista, now face Norse berserkers fighting alongside Algonquin warriors. The race for gold and souls becomes a desperate struggle against an entrenched and powerful pagan civilization that controls the northern half of the continent. The history of the Americas is no longer a story of European conquest, but of a clash between three worlds: the Christian European, the pagan Norse American, and the still powerful native empires of the south, like the Aztecs and Inca. This completely alters the balance of global power. The vast wealth of the Americas does not flow exclusively to Christian Spain and Portugal, fueling their imperial ambitions. It is contested, split, with a significant portion flowing back to the pagan north, further strengthening their position in the Old World. Vinland's enduring saga doesn't just give the Vikings a new continent, it denies one to their enemies, ensuring the conflict between the hammer and the cross will be fought on a truly global scale. Let's allow the currents of time to flow forward, past the centuries of crusades, past the age of sail, and into a recognisable, technologically advanced present. What does a modern Scandinavia, the heart of a world that never abandoned its old gods, look and feel like? It would be a place of fascinating contradictions, a society that embraces science and high technology, yet is deeply rooted in an ancient mythic worldview. This is not a quaint living history museum. This is a modern, secularized, yet profoundly pagan state. The first thing you might notice is the symbolism woven into the fabric of public life. The national flags of Denmark, Norway and Sweden do not bear the Christian cross. Instead, they might feature a stylized Mjolnir, the head of Odin's raven, or the stark white image of Yggdrasil on a field of deep blue. These symbols are everywhere, on the tail fins of supersonic fighter jets, on the logos of multinational corporations specializing in genetics or telecommunications, on the kits of their globally famous football teams. It is not an aggressive, proselytizing symbolism, but a calm, confident expression of national identity, much like the Union Jack or the Stars and Stripes. The political and social structure of this modern pagan Scandinavia would be markedly different, a legacy of its unique historical development. The crucial historical fact is that this society never went through the feudal period in the same way as Christian Europe. The tradition of the thing, the local assembly where free people made decisions for their community, evolved but never vanished. This has resulted in a political system that is radically decentralized and deeply democratic, perhaps resembling a more robust version of Swiss cantonal government. Local communities hold a great deal of power. The national government's role is primarily focused on defence, foreign policy, and maintaining the all-thing, a federal assembly of representatives from the local councils. Concepts like the divine right of kings or the absolute authority of a central state never took root. The highest political value is not obedience, but personal liberty balanced with community responsibility. The moral and ethical landscape would also be distinct. Without the concepts of original sin, divine commandments, or a final judgment leading to eternal paradise or damnation, the society's values are grounded elsewhere. The Old Norse virtues of courage, honour, haida, hospitality, self-reliance, and loyalty to kin are the cornerstones of their ethical system. This creates a society that is fiercely individualistic yet bound by a strong sense of social contract. A quirky, humanizing detail of this would be their legal system. A major crime might be seen not as a sin against God, but as a dishonourable act that has damaged the fabric of the community. Justice might focus less on punishment and more on restitution, and the public restoration of honour, both for the victim and, if possible, for the perpetrator. Oaths would still hold a semi-mystical weight, and business deals might still be sealed with a solemn public handshake that carries the weight of a sacred bond. The state's relationship with religion is a form of pragmatic secularism. The organised Odinic faith, with its temple complexes and its godar, exists and is respected as a crucial part of the national heritage, much like the Church of England. Most people would be culturally pagan. They'd celebrate Yule, attend a wedding at a temple, and tell their children the stories of Thor and Loki. But deep theological belief would be a private matter. The scientific empirical tradition that grew out of their unique intellectual history has led to a society that is generally sceptical of supernatural claims. The scholarly debate about faith versus reason would have a different flavour. The gods are seen by many not as literal beings living in Asgard, but as powerful psychological archetypes, as personifications of the forces of nature and the human spirit. Odin is the symbol of the relentless quest for knowledge, Thor the embodiment of protective strength, Freya the archetype of love and fierce independence. To be a believer is to find meaning in this ancient symbolic language, not necessarily to expect thunder on command. This society would have a profoundly different relationship with nature. The belief in a world tree, in sacred groves, and in nature spirits, Landvetter, would have evolved into a deep-seated environmentalism. A pristine forest or a clean fjord is not just an ecological good, it is a sacred space. This would translate into strict environmental laws, a world-leading green technology sector, and a popular culture that celebrates hiking, sailing, and a rugged outdoor lifestyle as a way of connecting with the world. The idea of dominion over nature, a key concept in Genesis, is entirely alien. Humans are a part of nature's web, not its divinely appointed masters, and what of its darker side? This society, founded on a warrior ethos and a history of existential conflict, might also be more militaristic and have a harsher view of outsiders. While hospitable to guests, it might be slow to trust other nations and cultures. The virtues of the warrior, strength, decisiveness, a willingness to fight for what is yours, could in a negative light manifest as a form of aggressive nationalism or a might makes right philosophy in international relations. The society might be more tolerant of internal dissent, but less tolerant of perceived external threats. It would be a complex, mature, and deeply fascinating civilization, a vision of modernity that took a different path through the woods, following the raven's flight instead of the shepherd's call. Zooming out from the shores of our alternate Scandinavia, we see a world where the continued existence of a major European pagan power has reshaped the entire global religious and political landscape. The tidy divisions of our own world, the Christian West, the Islamic world, the spheres of Hinduism and Buddhism, are complicated by a powerful, technologically advanced, and ideologically distinct pagan bloc. This creates a world of many gods and many new tensions. The most profound impact is on the identity of Christendom itself. In our timeline, after the fall of Constantinople, the primary other for Western Christianity was Islam. This rivalry shaped European art, philosophy and politics for centuries. In this alternate world, Christianity is trapped in a pincer. To its south and east lies the familiar challenge of Islam, but to its north lies the ancient enemy, the pagan, an enemy that is not foreign and distant, but European, white, and in many ways disturbingly familiar. This forces Christianity to define itself not just against Islam, but against its own ancestral past. The crucial historical fact is that this constant close proximity struggle prevents the European Christian psyche from ever fully relaxing. The Reformation, if it happens at all, would be a vastly different affair, likely suppressed as a dangerous internal division at a time when external unity is paramount. The papacy would likely retain a much stronger, more centralized control over a fortress Christendom, demanding absolute doctrinal unity in the face of the dual threat. This creates a tripolar world of faith and power. The three major Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, which see themselves as successive revelations of a single god, are now confronted by a sophisticated philosophical paganism that rejects their core premise entirely. This isn't a collection of minor folk religions to be dismissed as superstition. It's the state religion of a nuclear-armed, economically powerful federation of nations, the North Sea Alliance, perhaps. This forces a global theological dialogue that is simply absent from our history. Christian and Muslim theologians would have to seriously grapple with questions posed by pagan philosophers. Why is monotheism superior? What is the logical basis for revelation? Why is your linear view of time and salvation more valid than our cyclical mythic understanding? The scholarly debate about the clash of civilizations is no longer a binary contest. It's a complex three-way conversation, with paganism acting as the eternal contrarian, the ultimate none-of-the-above option. on the geopolitical ballot. The political alignments of the modern world would be completely scrambled. The concept of the West as a coherent Judeo-Christian entity would not exist. Instead, you might have a Christian alliance, led by a Franco-German Catholic bloc and perhaps a rump Christian Britain, an Islamic conference, and the Norse Rus Federation. Nations would align based on faith as much as on economics. A quirky, humanizing detail of this new geopolitics would be the strange bedfellows it creates. A secular democratic India might find it has more in common and better relations with the pluralistic, environmentally conscious pagans of the North than with the dogmatic monotheists of Europe or the Middle East. Japan, with its own sophisticated Shinto religious tradition, might see the Norse as kindred spirits, nations that have successfully modernized without abandoning their ancestral faith. This creates an alliance of old gods, a bloc of nations resisting the cultural and religious homogenization of the Abrahamic faiths. The survival of European paganism would also have a profound effect on a global scale, by providing a template for other indigenous cultures. The successful resistance of the Norse would serve as a powerful inspiration for native peoples around the world during the age of colonialism. When Christian missionaries arrive in Africa, the Americas, or Polynesia, they would not be seen as bearers of an unassailable universal truth. They would be seen as agents of just one of several competing global belief systems. Indigenous leaders might look to the Norse model and think, they kept their gods and their freedom. Why can't we? This could lead to the emergence of reformed, syncretic and politically assertive indigenous religions worldwide, capable of resisting colonial-era conversion. The world would be far more religiously diverse, a vibrant and sometimes chaotic mosaic of faiths, rather than the more consolidated religious world we know. This alternate reality would also change the very language of our modern values. Concepts we take for granted as universal, such as human rights, are deeply rooted in the Christian philosophical tradition of Imago Dei, the idea that every human is made in the image of God and thus possesses inherent dignity. A world where this idea is not universally dominant would have to find a different basis for its ethics. The pagan North might ground its concept of rights not in divine endowment, but in the social contract of the thing. Rights are not given. They are mutually agreed upon and defended by the community for the community's own strength. This might lead to a world with several competing definitions of universal rights, each rooted in a different civilizational worldview, making international law and organizations like the United Nations incredibly complex and contentious. The world of many gods is a world of many truths, a world that is more pluralistic, more volatile, and perhaps more honest about the deep and enduring differences that define the human story. And so, we return to the quiet edge of that fjord, where the last embers of the Jarl's funeral ship hiss into the dark water. The ship is gone, the soul has begun its journey, and the horns are silent. But the echo of that defiant choice made 1,000 years ago in the smoky halls of the North still resonates down to our imagined present. It's an echo that has shaped a world that is at once familiar and profoundly alien. Looking back from the vantage point of this alternate now, what have we truly gained, and what have we lost? What is the final legacy of a world where the Vikings never knelt? Humanity gained a form of diversity that our own world has lost. The survival of a sophisticated, intellectually vibrant European paganism acted as a firebreak against the kind of religious and cultural monoculture that dominated our own history. It proved that there was another way to be European, another way to be modern. This world is richer in its philosophies, its mythologies, and its answers to the great questions of existence. The tree of knowledge, Yggdrasil, was allowed to grow alongside the tree of life, and its strange, unexpected fruits nourished a different kind of civilization. This world had never had to suffer the agony of the wars of religion that tore Christian Europe apart in the 16th and 17th centuries because the lines were drawn much earlier and much more clearly. The conflict was always external, not internal, which paradoxically might have made for a more stable, if more divided, continent. But something was undeniably lost. The Christian ideal, however imperfectly it was practiced, contained within it a radical seed, the idea of universal love, the intrinsic worth of every individual regardless of strength or status, the command to care for the poor, the weak, and the meek. The pagan world, with its focus on honour, strength, and the warrior ethos, might have created a society that was in many ways more honest and more free, but perhaps also harsher, less forgiving. The great hospitals, the universities, the international legal frameworks, all children of the Christian tradition in our world, would have either never been born or would have grown from a different, colder soil. The comfort and hope that the promise of salvation offered to billions throughout history is absent, replaced by a stoic acceptance of a fate woven by the Norns, a worldview that offers glory but little in the way of grace. The question that lingers in the quiet of this alternate night is about the nature of progress itself. Was the triumph of monotheism a necessary step in human development, a levelling up of our collective consciousness? Or was it an accident of history, a path taken that foreclosed other equally valid possibilities? The crucial historical fact is that history is not a neat linear progression towards a predetermined goal. It is a chaotic, branching river, full of eddies and currents, and a small change upstream can carve a whole new canyon downstream. The survival of the Norse gods is one such change. It reminds us that our modern world, with its values and assumptions, was not inevitable. It was built on the bones of other possible worlds, on the echoes of choices made and not made. Thinking about this alternate path allows us to see our own world with fresh eyes. It forces us to ask why we believe what we believe. Are our ethics truly universal, or are they the product of a very specific cultural inheritance? A quirky, humanizing detail to end on might be to imagine an archaeologist in this pagan-influenced world unearthing the ruins of a small, forgotten Christian monastery in the English countryside. They would dust off the strange icon of a man nailed to a cross, read the fragmented texts about a god of suffering and forgiveness, and struggle to understand the mindset of a people who worshipped a deity who chose to die rather than to fight. To them, our history would be the what if, the strange and improbable timeline. They would debate what our world might have looked like, marvelling at its unique blend of compassion and violence, its soaring cathedrals and its brutal holy wars. Ultimately, the story of the Vikings who never converted is not just a story about longships and gods of thunder. It's a story about identity and the power of a culture to resist, to adapt, and to endure. It's a reflection on the choices that define us, and a quiet acknowledgement that the world we inhabit is just one saga among many that could have been told. The horn has sounded, the tale is told, and the long night awaits. The fire has burned down to glowing coals on the hearth, and the great hall has grown quiet. The stories of this other world, this world of the unbent horn and the defiant gods, fade back into the mists from whence they came. They leave us with a profound sense of the fragility of the present, a realization that the reality we know is a delicate tapestry woven from countless threads of chance and choice. Had one thread been plucked differently, had one king made a different calculation, had one battle turned another way, the entire pattern would have been changed. This journey wasn't about celebrating one path over the other, but about appreciating the sheer depth and complexity of the human story. It's about understanding that the values we hold dear, the societies we build, and the futures we envision are not the only ones possible. The echoes of Odin, Thor, and Freya in this alternate timeline remind us that the search for meaning, for a way to explain the thunder and the stars, is a fundamental human impulse, one that has found a multitude of expressions across the ages. The world we've imagined tonight, with its Northern Crusades, its enduring Vinland, and its radically different modernity, feels epic and strange, yet at its heart, it is still a world of people striving, loving, fighting, and seeking their place in the cosmos. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through these phantom histories. Imagine the sight of a dragon-proud ship on the horizon, of a world you never knew, and consider the silent, invisible legacies of the paths not taken that lie buried just beneath the surface of our own. The past is never truly past. It is a landscape of ghosts, and tonight we have walked with a few of them.